So back in the previous review that I have made with the Acer Aspire A314, it is one of the best budget laptop here in the Philippines. In 2020, you also have the Aspire A315 41G. But here is my full review, and if you want to buy a second-hand one, what are the things that you need to take note for? With that said, let's proceed to the video. Apart from being an AMD Ryzen machine for $35,995, you're getting something that is really quite simplistic in terms of cutting costs and corners out on this laptop. So I could actually say that you don't have USB Type-C since you also have a Ryzen 7 on this system. We're going to talk about the specs later on, but first things first is of course that the build quality is really decent. It's not what you can expect to be the most durable type of plastic durability that is dependable, so you can expect some auto cracks if you are going to use this laptop for a long session if you're not really careful for. Keyboard flex is really quite minimal for this, but on the lid itself is something that is really quite noticeable, so I could say there are things that needs to cut corners for. But at least it's really quite convenient to use with 3 USB ports, and left and right handed users might find this one comfortable. More on which onto the LCD display. It's not really one of the best displays out there for that kind of price due to the fact it is still ATM panel. That is really quite a cut corner where this one doesn't have a narrow edge bezel that is greater in terms of screen to body ratio. While I could say that this one is still poor when it comes to bright light environment, I could say for indoor use it is really comfortable, and since you also have anti-glare coating, you can do all of your work without any kind of hassle with reflections if you have a glossy display. While the 640x480 webcam in 2022 is quite ridiculous to be said that needs to be updated, this thing is actually what you can expect for its quality and of course its sound. That this thing is not really keeping up to the competition. It is really quite reasonable for Skype calls, conference calls, and online school. This is the camera test on the Acer Aspire 3A 315. So kinda similar to the Pentium variant, you can see that the quality is actually really quite hazy even for a really strong lighting. The camera is not really good, as much you can see some of the grains, and it's not very clear. But let me know down in the comments, but here is a keyboard test, so we're just going to type on the quick brown fox. So you can actually expect that the keyboard and using the microphone at the same time is what you can expect that this one is not really good. But let's proceed on to the next part. Well, on the keyboard, I do say that Acer cuts corners when it comes to the keyboard itself. Since this one doesn't have any kind of backlighting, you don't have any options at all. So you're stuck with this keyboard, but at least when it comes to its spacing, its comfortability for a long typing session, it is really quite convenient even when it comes to a short amount of travel. As the touchpad is really quite massive and really quite bigger, you can actually do some navigation and transferring data files from one window to another. While when we go on to the specification in 2022, is this really quite worth it? We have the Ryzen 7 2700U, 4GB of RAM and 128 gigs of storage. But moving on when it comes to its performance, the Ryzen 7 2700 when we are going to compare to the 1005G1 and also the 11th Gen Core i3 processor that we're going to talk about that on a brand new laptop, there are things that needs to be considered as a really quite decent approach for the Ryzen 7 to perform. Even though it is really quite cool to have 8 threads for this kind of processor, it's not really quite close as what you can expect to be a little bit neck and neck in single core for the i3 1005G1, but the i3 11th Gen really outperforms the Ryzen 7. But more in which that is just numbers when it comes to Cinebench R15. In real world performance, you can do all of your work from web browsing, doing some video editing and other rendering medias that you're going to do like Photoshop, music production, and also for light AutoCAD use. This thing is really helpful. And thanks to the 535 graphics card, this is a GDDR5 based GPU that is capable for handling some lighter games. So you can expect to play Valorant, more in which Genshin Impact for this kind of laptop, but we're going to talk about that later on. So first things first is of course that the SSD will give you some benefits when it comes to transferring data or even launching applications, even when you're going to use this laptop for a cold boot start, that this thing is snappy to the max. But you can actually expect from its performance that this one, in terms of gaming, even though you have the 535 GPU, you still have some bottlenecks when it comes to the memory. Since you only have 4GB of RAM on the system, you don't have any kind of capability to play competitively on Valorant. That 4GB of RAM is not great for gaming. Especially on Genshin Impact that we have tested out on low settings, and I forgot to mention Valorant uses low settings at 1080p, same as Genshin Impact with the same resolution and the quality of the game itself. Where Genshin Impact really struggles a little bit onto the hiccups, that 4GB of RAM is one of the bottlenecks that the GPU doesn't actually give you so much potential if you have a lower memory. When we go to Need for Speed, I could say that this thing is actually really quite decent for Need for Speed Heat to perform, but like I said, if you have 4GB of RAM, having 8 or 16 gigs will give you some beneficial if you're going to play games a little bit more in terms of smooth frame rate. Well, when we go on to the thermals though, we have tested out using our thermal scanner, and you can see that this one is really quite comfortable if you're going to use the laptop on your palm while playing on your keyboard with the WASD keys. That is not really quite hot. But the only thing that is really quite good for this laptop, it doesn't thermal throttle and it stays cool and quiet even for office-based use. So when we go on to the thermal selection, you can see on their chart, this thing is really comfortable even for a long day of session, especially when gaming and all the other scenarios that you're going to use this laptop for. Even though I wanted to say something about the upgradability, that is really quite exceptional for 1 out of 5, that you can easily access the memory and the hard drive itself, requiring you to remove the whole bottom panel to access some of the other components like the SSD, that is M.2, Wi-Fi card, and of course some other components that you can easily replace, but the CPU and GPU is still on board. So it's a little bit more kinda strange to have a dummy on the fan placement, that there's also an option for you to have a dual fan for this kind of configuration if you want to add more better temperatures, if you know what I mean. But when it comes to the audio quality, it shares the same with the A314. I mean, it's not really one of the best sounding speakers, but at least it performs what you can expect for a speaker that is really quite capable when it comes to movie watching and other media consumption that you always do on a daily basis. When we go on to the battery, I could say that this one is on the short side. Even though you have a ULB CPU Ryzen 7, it is still a powerful chip that is based on the ULB platform. But you can actually notice from its performance that the battery life is quite substantial for what you can expect for a Ryzen system. So before we go on to the conclusion, we are going to find out what are the things that is really quite a hit and miss, and of course what are the things that you need to take note for. So I do say that you don't have USB Type-C. That is one of a downer for this kind of device. But even though it is quite a downer, you still have some of the ports that is still easily accessible. Number 2 is always about the display. TM panel in 2022 is something that is really what you can expect to be a little bit decent but not really that perfect for its color accuracy, and of course the viewing angles is one of the poorest type of panel, but it can actually save a little bit more battery life compared to IPS. The webcam also is one of the most outdated type of video calling. If you're going to need something that is really high in quality, this thing doesn't really offer that much. I know, it kinda cuts costs for this kind of laptop, but there's also another thing, the battery life. When it comes to the battery, I could see that this one is really good. Let's say it's not really one of the best sweet spot, that the battery life is something that is needed to be more improved, especially for a watt hour, that this thing is not really quite enough for this kind of CPU to handle even for 8-hour work. Now let's talk about some of the things that you need to take note for when buying one. Like I said earlier about the hinge design on this, there are some plastic bits that can be broken and you need to be careful when it comes to opening up the laptop. And there's another thing. When it comes to this kind of laptop, yes, if you need a backlit keyboard, this isn't going to be the best sweet spot for you, that you need to have a different laptop that you're going to purchase with a backlit keyboard. And there's even more. When it comes to a laptop in this kind of category, 4 gigs of RAM is not really quite enough for all of your professional work, and especially for gaming in terms of playing competitively. And of course, for a second-hand laptop like this, you can actually get something that is really quite affordable, but if you want to get something that is more pristine in condition, that is really a great way to go if you want to have something that is really great for performance and is still very reliable and taken care of. So here's my conclusion. I could say for a budget laptop, it kinda changes some of the things, having a better performance CPU that is really capable for work, play, and of course for other use case scenarios. But even though it is one of the slimmest, there are some cutting costs here and there that needs to be perfect. I know it's not a perfect laptop as what you can expect for its budget, but at least this thing is really quite capable as an all-round machine. So if you want to see more videos like this, go hit the thumbs up button, sub, and tap on the notification bell. And this is Norms, and I'll catch you guys in the next one, and as always, stay cool.